This show is not important. What is important is that we get to live in a country that allows us to have a show like this. I've had the opportunity to meet and spend time with comedians and talk show hosts from countries like Russia, countries in the Middle East, who tell me they would get thrown in prison for making fun of those in power, and worse than being thrown in prison. They know how lucky we are here. Our freedom to speak is what they admire most about this country.
So I just played you some excerpts from Jimmy Kimmel's return monologue, which actually aired last night at the time that I'm recording this video. And of course, as basically everybody would have assumed, he decided to make 80% of this monologue not about how he lied about the circumstances of Charlie Kirk's assassination, but instead he decided to frame it as him fighting against the Trump administration, fighting against the FCC, and specifically utilizing FCC Chair Carr's comments against him and against ABC as his justification for being able to fight back against them and stand up for free speech. Jimmy Kimmel, the guy who supported absolutely every cancellation ever, who has supported the Biden regime's crackdown on misinformation, which is in reality just crackdowns on freedom of speech, is now able to position himself as fighting against government censorship because, as I told you in the previous video that I did on this, Carr fumbled the bag by getting involved in this situation, by saying anything related to this, because the organic response against Jimmy Kimmel was actually real. It was actually gaining ground. But of course, when the government puts their thumb on the scale, when they intervene, it becomes a story about government censorship, which of course ends up making Jimmy Kimmel a victim, or at least able to play the victim as he did in this monologue. And by the way, there's going to be a lot of people that are coping out there that are telling you that this monologue isn't good, and in reality it's not funny. It has no comedy elements at all whatsoever. That's why Jimmy Kimmel's ratings have been so low over the last couple of years, because the guy doesn't actually tell jokes. But the idea that this wasn't masterfully executed is just a cope, 100%, because Kimmel not only was able to position himself as somebody standing up against the Trump administration, against the FCC, against legitimate threats leveled by the FCC chair in one of the greatest own goal situations I've seen in years, but he also capped off his monologue by praising Erica Kirk, who has been attacked repeatedly by the left-wing media ever since her husband's assassination, but he praised her specifically for that powerful moment at the Charlie Kirk Memorial where she decided to forgive her husband's killer.
A moment over the weekend, a very beautiful moment. I don't know if you saw this. On Sunday, Erica Kirk forgave the man who shot her husband. She forgave him. That is an example we should follow. If you believe in the teachings of Jesus, as I do, there it was. That's it. A selfless act of grace, forgiveness from a grieving widow. It touched me deeply, and I hope it touches many. And if there's anything we should take from this tragedy to carry forward, I hope it can be that, and not this. So thank you for listening, and I'll have more to say when we come back.
Now, again, another cope that I've heard from a lot of people is, okay, well, Kimmel came back. Maybe his monologue actually hit all the points that he wanted to hit. Maybe we inadvertently allowed him to play the victim in a situation where he and his writing team were trying to smear Trump supporters, the people who are most likely to be mourning the loss of Charlie Kirk, as responsible for his assassination. But at least Sinclair and Nexstar actually pulled him from their local affiliate stations. So it's not like a lot of people ended up seeing this monologue, and it turns out the exact opposite is true once again. Again, we have polling from the news media that basically shows us that over 20 times as many people, and I estimated, by the way, when I was predicting this outcome, it would be 10x, but it's over 20 times the amount of people saw this monologue versus Jimmy Kimmel's average.
Huge, absolutely huge. What are we talking about here? Well, let's take a look at YouTube views, Jimmy Kimmel Live video views. The 6-month median, the median video only gets 240,000. Look how many views Tuesday night's monologue already has. 6 6.7 million. That's over 25 times as large as the median Jimmy Kimmel video normally gets. And I was looking, it is by far the largest video in at least 6 months. So if Donald Trump's idea was to give Jimmy Kimmel more press and more viewership, he absolutely did so. Of course, I don't think that is what Donald Trump intended to do.
Do you have any sense beyond YouTube of just how big his appeal may have been? Like, a lot of people wanted to clearly watch this from all facets of, not just in America, but this is from around the world.
That's exactly right. So we got this 6.7 million. I will note that number is up already about 700,000 from the last time I checked, which was about an hour ago. But take a look here. Record high Google searches last night for what time is Jimmy Kimmel on. You wouldn't have to check what time Jimmy Kimmel was on if you were a regular viewer. The reason that people were checking what time Jimmy Kimmel was on, because he was potentially pulling in a lot of viewers who normally didn't watch. And get this, it was up over 10,000%.
So let's recap how this ended up playing out. You had Jimmy Kimmel completely vulnerable, a guy that's absolute scum that cheers on the cancellation of a bunch of different other people, cheered on the Biden administration's crackdowns on misinformation, which of course are acts of censorship. He had incredibly low ratings on his show. Remember, 240K for a show that cost that much to produce in a dying industry, the television industry, with a dying business model, which is these late night show business models. And instead of letting him suffer the consequences of his own words due to an organic response, instead of him potentially getting booted off the air permanently, he essentially served like a 2-day suspension, came back on the air to 20x the audience, was able to not apologize for lying about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and instead he was able to play the victim. He was able to say that he in fact is a champion of free speech, that it's about all of us versus the evil folks over at the FCC, and he did it to 20x the audience. He did it to cheers. He did it to, again, benefit his career and essentially make him cancel-proof for at least 2 years. So this was a complete and total failure, make no mistake about it, and Jimmy Kimmel worked every single angle during that monologue. He talked about how Trump wanted to get hardworking Americans that work on his show fired.
And I think unjustly, this puts them at risk. The President of the United States made it very clear he wants to see me and the hundreds of people who work here fired from our jobs. Our leader celebrates Americans losing their livelihoods because he can't take a joke. He was somehow able to squeeze Colbert out of CBS. Then he turned his sights on me, and now he's openly rooting for NBC to fire Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers and the hundreds of Americans who work for their shows who don't make millions of dollars. And I hope that if that happens, or if there's even any hint of that happening, you will be 10 times as loud as you were this week.
And again, it's all because Carr had to open his big stupid mouth on the Benny Johnson podcast, threaten an investigation, try to sound like a mafioso where he's like, you can do this the easy way or the hard way. And he said, oh, ABC or the local affiliates can either do something about changing content related to Jimmy Kimmel, or maybe the FCC is going to open investigations.
And what people don't understand is that the broadcasters, and you've gotten this right, are entirely different than people that use other forms of communication. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
What would you like to see done at ABC?
Well, look, I think what you said there strikes me as a very reasonable, minimal step that can be taken. I mean, obviously, look, there's calls for Kimmel to be fired. I think, you could certainly see a path forward for suspension over this. And again, the FCC is going to have remedies that we could look at. And at the FCC, we need to reinvigorate this. So again, there's actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters. And frankly, I think that it's really sort of past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on Comcast and Disney and say, listen, we are going to preempt. We are not going to run Kimmel anymore until you straighten this out, because we licensed broadcaster, are running the possibility of fines or license revocations from the FCC if we continue to run content that ends up being a pattern of news distortion. So I think, again, Disney needs to see some change here, but the individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say, this, garbage, to the extent that that's what comes down the pipe in the future, isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. But this sort of status quo is obviously not acceptable where we are.
That we are in this situation where Jimmy Kimmel, who should be groveling on his knees right now, is riding higher than he ever has in his entire career, especially since his pivot to woke comedy, which is non-comedy. It's just lecturing you. It's just being an agent of the Democratic Party. And again, this was all an own goal. This was all preventable. People have been sending me this clip from Timcast IRL where Tim criticizes me because he says that I have the position that we shouldn't fight back against evil. And then through the conversation, he somehow gets into Nazi lawyering in the Nuremberg trials, which is a rather odd connection. Let me play a little bit of that for you right here.
And with all due respect to Sean Fitzgerald, who he's a good dude. His argument is effectively, we mustn't stop evil because when we do let evil take over, they will do evil things to us. And I'm sitting here like, we know. The evil guy who's trying to break into your house intends on murdering you. And that's how I see it. There are questions about when we defend the rights of those we disagree with, and we do, when there's no threat. See, World War II is a great example. The Nuremberg trials. We say, we put these people on trial, and we prove to the world the crimes they committed. That's a good thing. We did it after we won. We're bringing those people into an area where they don't pose a threat to us, and we expose what they did. And I agree with that. And people afforded them a defense, and I agree with that as well. Criminals deserve a fair trial, and they were convicted. So right now, people are saying, Tim, I'm not defending the left. I'm defending the principle of free speech. Indeed, and at the Nuremberg trials, I know it's Godwin's law, but it's a good example. They had lawyers. People provided them a defense. The goal was the overarching principle of a right to a fair trial.
And look, while it's entirely possible that Tim only saw that one tweet, if you actually followed me on Twitter, if you actually watched my video that I did on this, I never said at all whatsoever that we should not fight against the left. We should not push back against the left. And in fact, I have said repeatedly that I do not care at all whatsoever about any lefties getting fired or suffering social consequences due to the fact that they're expressing their opinion, when their opinion is people on my side of the political spectrum, like Charlie Kirk, should be assassinated for their opinion. When their opinion is murder is an acceptable response to speech, in my opinion, getting fired from your job is being let off incredibly easy by your own standard. But what I do have a problem with is setting yourself up for failure. What I do have a problem with is adopting the government censorship regime of the Biden administration through the FCC in such a public and stupid way, and a bunch of people, not the whole right, but huge portions of the right, getting on board and using ridiculous things like the redheaded libertarian ended up using, which is the hoax doctrine, even though she clearly and obviously didn't read it. I mean, we went over this before on a previous video, but I think it's incredibly important for you guys to understand how stupid it is to cite the hoax doctrine in order to get rid of Jimmy Kimmel, because while the first plank of the hoax doctrine says that you have to say something that is false and you have to know it's false while you're saying it, there are two other planks that were 100% not met at all whatsoever by Jimmy Kimmel's lie in that previous episode. Again, this rule prohibits broadcast licensees or permittees from broadcasting false information concerning a crime or catastrophe if 1. The licensee knows the information is false. 2. It is foreseeable that the broadcast of the information will cause substantial public harm. And 3. Broadcast of the information does in fact cause direct substantial public harm. Now it goes on to say, for the purposes of this rule, public harm must begin immediately and cause direct actual damage to property or health or safety of the general public or diversion of law enforcement or other public health and safety authorities from their duties. movies. Crime, according to this set of rules, is any act or omission that makes the offender subject to criminal punishment by law. A catastrophe is a disaster or imminent disaster involving violent or sudden event affecting the public. Now look, I understand that people don't like to read. It's difficult, it's confusing, it hurts my brain parts, and it makes me really upset and want to throw something against the TV. But in reality, if you can't read 3 sentences and an accompanying paragraph to understand that this law has absolutely nothing to do with what Jimmy Kimmel said on air related to Charlie Kirk that started this whole controversy, you are an absurd, ridiculous individual. Again, you need to have the clear public harm immediately after the broadcast, and it has to be a direct result of the broadcast, because guess what? The First Amendment is paramount in this country, and obviously we should hold speech in the highest regards. That being said, Kimmel likely would have been pulled off the air anyway due to the fact that the ABC affiliates were flooded with a bunch of messages and a bunch of letters that were very upset about what he said and the intention behind it, which of course was to frame the Charlie Kirk base and the Trump base for Charlie Kirk's assassination. But all of that was undercut by Carr opening his mouth. So no, my position isn't that we shouldn't fight against the left, that we shouldn't be afraid to use the left's own tactics. But when you go above and beyond, when you start deciding that you're going to use the FCC in a way that, by the way, publicly the left hasn't used, that's when you run into trouble. And by the way, what I find incredibly obnoxious about this is that not only does this become the story, this ridiculous attempt at FCC censorship is what grabs people's attention, but in reality, same day that this ended up happening, Jimmy Kimmel returning to the air, we actually got YouTube to admit that the Biden administration behind the scenes was pressuring them to censor and suppress accounts, which again is the same tactic, but the Biden administration actually had the sense to hide this. It only came out later, and now YouTube has decided, due to the fact that this was revealed to the public, that they're going to let those account holders actually get back on the platform until, of course, they violate another terms of service under another Democratic administration, which immediately they will flip back to this censorship regime. So let me just throw out what could have happened if we were in an alternative universe where Carr shut his damn mouth and didn't go beyond his duties as FCC chair and start threatening freedom of speech. Jimmy Kimmel would have maybe never come back on air, or Jimmy Kimmel would have actually came back on air. However, all the pressure in the world would be on him to actually apologize for the things that he said, which, make no mistake about it, even though he said very nice things about Erica Kirk, he never actually apologized during this monologue. In fact, he actually never mentioned Charlie Kirk by name during this 20-minute monologue, but he would have had to come back under different circumstances, not had a way to call out the FCC and the government for cracking down on him, and a much larger portion of this monologue would have been Jimmy Kimmel not playing the victim. At the same time that the left was complaining about cancel culture that people like Jimmy Kimmel have championed over and over and over again for damn near a decade, if not longer, we would have got news that broke that the Biden administration was actually abusing government power in order to censor people on social media. So again, we would have had both narratives at the same time to use against the left, which is, one, it's your own standards, your own cancel culture standards being thrown right back in your face. How does it taste? And two, on top of that, we would have had legitimate government censorship that would not be obscured by the FCC's actions that we could point to from the Biden administration. But instead, that YouTube story got basically buried. Almost nobody's talking about it. And even when it is brought up in a counter argument against the left wing, they'll say, what about Carr? What about his stupid ass comments on the FCC? And what about our martyr for freedom of speech, even though he's a champion of cancel culture, Jimmy Kimmel? And for those of you who are going to make the claim that Jimmy Kimmel would have played victim no matter what, everything would have worked out exactly as it did had Carr shut his mouth, I will point out for everybody out there in the audience, because you might not have heard about it, that Stephen Colbert is using a much weaker case to claim that he is somehow the victim of government censorship, because CBS announced that they won't be continuing his show after the end of next year. And he has been pushing this for a very long time. However, it's gotten about 5% the attention as the Kimmel situation, because when the government buds in, when you have an FCC chair go off on a wildly inappropriate rant and start threatening to revoke licenses and to abuse government power, that ends up creating a better victim narrative. So no, absolutely Absolutely not. He would have gotten 5% of the attention had it been similar to the Colbert situation. However, Carr decided to fumble the bag, kick the ball into the own goal, and then celebrate like he just won the World Cup. Now look, on this channel, I'm here to entertain you a little bit, but I'm more importantly here to tell you what I think and what I think is important for you to know. And it is very important for you guys to understand that this was an easy victory. This was a layup, a slam dunk, if you will, and it ended up turning into an own goal. And there's all these different various people that are trying to cope with the fact that they were on the wrong side of this. They didn't see this coming, and it's absolutely embarrassing. Again, Jimmy Kimmel spoke to 20x the viewership after his cancellation, and he didn't even apologize. Now, there were reports that he was going to double down, but imagine if he were able to double down the next day that he came on without this overhanging FCC threat. And the response to that, imagine how much more pressure would have been put on ABC. Imagine how much more pressure would have been put on his advertisers. I mean, all of these different local affiliates that held on to the fact that they're not going to let him back on their airwaves, they will eventually cave to Kimmel. And of course, ABC, if they want to really speak truth to power and fight back against them, can always threaten to pull things like football games and other major sporting events that these local affiliates rely on, and that will be a disaster in every way for them. So of course they will capitulate, and this is an unmitigated disaster and a victory for Jimmy Kimmel. We handed Jimmy Kimmel a victory. A guy who is unfunny, cried over a lion once, and did all of these ridiculous, absurd things, is essentially an agent for the Democratic Party. We handed him a victory as a free speech activist, as this is a guy who has previously called for censorship. So yeah, it's crazy, it's insane, it's absurd, but I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been an absolute disaster in every possible way. Till next time.